have.
Well, the other problem that we're trying to find people to come fix it. You know, you call up and you're like,
Mug in the middle.
oh, we've only got one guy.
No, Jack's directing our
We
seats.
got to wait for him to get up for
Somebody else.
I'm just so fed up.
Nightmare stories about people having
A mouse in case you want me to use it.
so you gotta know what you're doing. You
Yeah.
can improve this.
Well, and that was, I mean, 8 years ago.
This used to be my seat.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Planning Commission meeting for Monday, November 13th. Let's have a roll call.
Alderman Becky Schaefer,
Oh, I got promoted. I'm here.
you're first. Alderman Stoker.
Here.
Commissioner. Commissioner Lemke.
Here.
Commissioner Jim Schaefer.
Here.
Commissioner Chorin.
Here.
Commissioner Hawley.
Here.
Alderman Worth.
Here.
Mayor Abendroth.
Here. We have a
Morning,
quorum.
sorry.
First item is minutes of October 12th.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Next item is a public hearing for Aluminum Architects on behalf of Splash Swim and Wellness. The applicant is seeking conditional use grant amendment and building and site plan amendment approval to allow for a 3,228 square foot addition for the property at 10636 North Commerce Street in the Mequon Business Park.
Okay, so the addition is to allow for a second pool to the east of the existing building.
We have to have a public hearing.
Motion to open public hearing.
Second.
Second motion and a second to open the public hearing. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are now in public hearing. Is there anyone who wishes to address the commission on this issue? Seeing none.
Move to close.
Second.
Motion and a second to close the public hearing. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The public hearing is now closed.
Thanks, Mayor. As mentioned, the addition is to allow for a second pool and additional restroom facilities for the business. The existing pool has a capacity of 16, and the proposed pool will have a capacity of 10. As part of the project, they will be adding 4 additional stalls on site. Staff believes that with the total capacity of the 2 pools and the 9 total employees, that this will be sufficient parking for the site. And the addition to the east of the building will match materials and colors of the existing building. On the north elevation of the addition, they will be including a storefront window that matches the pattern and size of the existing window on the north elevation. The rest of the structure will be the exact materials and paint pattern as the existing building. Staff recommended landscaping along the south elevation as part of to help screen the existing dumpster from view. Let me try to zoom in here. So they did add landscaping as staff recommended to screen the dumpster from view off Executive Drive. Staff is recommending for them to add additional evergreen in the mix so that they can provide year-round screening of the dumpster.
Additional what? I couldn't.
Evergreen to the mix.
Evergreens.
As part of the project, the applicant is also requesting a temporary access off of Executive Drive for construction, and this will result in the removal of 1 street tree. This has been approved by the city forester, subject to the tree being replaced in diameter and species after construction is complete. Other than that, the engineering department has provided comments in the report, and Bridget can answer any questions that you may have. Staff is recommending approval. The conditional use grant amendment and use remains harmonious with the existing uses in the business park, and we also recommend approval of the building and site plan.
Thank you, Papula. I'll go to the applicant. Is there anything you'd like to add? And I note there's 10 conditions. Do you have any problem with those conditions?
Good evening. My name is Andrea Nemechek. I'm the architect for the applicant.
And I do have a few questions on the 10 items that were on the staff recommendations. One would be the evergreen buffer along Executive Drive. I'm just wondering if there's a specific location that staff would like to see that. Maybe we could replace a few of the shrubs with an evergreen instead, if they want to see some more screening towards the southeast corner, looking towards the dumpster.
Part of the recommendation would be you could replace some of the existing so that there was more of a mix to provide screening in the winter months as well. You wouldn't have to replace everything here currently with the evergreen. We just wanted a mixture so that it could blend in with the existing proposal.
Okay, so then the request would be for a revised landscaping plan, so we can take this plan, resubmit it, add an evergreen or two, and then work on that
Yeah, and
in-house
that's-
with staff?
Yeah, and that's at the condition 1 is the review of final site landscaping, so it can be at a staff level if the commissioner's okay with that.
Okay, thank you. And then question on number 3 as well. There was planning staff review and approval of dumpster screening detail. Are you talking about the landscape to screen that? Or are you talking about getting additional details specifically of the dumpster?
Actual plans of the dumpster, you provided samples here, but we wanted plans as well.
Okay, okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
That's it?
Those are the questions that I had. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioners? Alderman Worth?
I have one question for staff. I received an email from 2 residents today asking about, they were saying they're all in favor of the addition, but that there's the filtering system or the mechanical somehow on the existing building are noisy. Is there have you received any complaints or know anything about the mechanical, any noise from the mechanicals?
I haven't received any complaints in regards to this item. I don't think our department has. I don't know if
Okay.
there's any regulations, really.
Well, we don't have a specific sound standard, but as, you know, typical, we require like a 65 decibel at the property line. Haven't received any complaints since the business has been in use, so it's somewhat news to us in terms
Okay.
of the complaint.
I saw it late this afternoon, but you can check on it as they build it, but I'd move approval. Second.
Motion and a second to approve the conditional use grant and building and site plan amendment. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? You have been approved.
Thank
With
you.
staff on the landscaping.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next item, regular business. Sorry, Mr. Wu. Zengao Wu. The applicant is seeking a fill permit to allow for 7,000 cubic yards to modify the lot grading for landscaping at the property at 12813 Highgate Court in the Highgate subdivision. Bridget.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The applicant, as the mayor had mentioned, is seeking a minor request to fill in excess of 1,000 cubic yards. They did apply for and receive a fill permit last year for 2,500 cubic yards. So this would be in addition to that 2,500, so a total of 9,500 cubic yards. A plan was not submitted for this fill permit, so the staff is recommending tabling this minor request until a grading plan can be received.
You have any comments?
I'm okay with that, so.
Okay.
Move to table. Second.
All right. Motion and a second to table. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Item has been tabled. We'll see you back here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. The next item is Badger Lighting and Signs. The applicant is seeking reconsideration of the master sign plan amendment approval for the property at 11120 Cedarburg Road, which is Mr. B's restaurant.
Thank you, Mayor. As the commissioners may recall, this was in front of us in August of this year. It was denied by the Planning Commission. There was a hearing set for September 27th for the Board of Appeals. At the Board of Appeals meeting, it was difficult to contend with the new evidence was presented at the meeting itself. After questions from the chair of the board, the applicant stated at the meeting that the commission did not err in its findings, but basically just wanted another kind of kick at the cat. So they discussed several different angles about the signage at the meeting, and there were a couple things that came up within the transcripts that we felt we should be compelled to discuss. One of the items that came up was a substantial investment in the property, and I think Commissioner Parrish, who's not here this evening, did respond to that at the time of the August 11th meeting, talking about that we should work with the applicant to provide adequate signage so they're successful with the investment made. So we feel that that was somewhat discussed at the meeting. The other issue that came up with at the meeting was this issue of the westbound visibility of a signage for Mr. B. So what staff did, and I have the map up on the screen for you, is kind of take some pictures, and then I had, these are in your packet as well. I took some pictures at different spots along Mequon Road, and also labeled them and did some calculations to determine the visibility of the signage. If you look at some of the, I'll start from this would be letter A. This is coming down Mequon Road just before you get to the bridge. And at this point, as you can see from the angle of the building is somewhat, it's not perpendicular to Mequon Road in this location, it's on an angle, so you have very little visibility of that facade of the building. You can actually see, and it's tough to see on the screen, but maybe on your computer it's better, you actually can't see the monument sign there that shows Mr. B's logo. As you go forward, this is B on the plan. This is kind of the first point where you can actually kind of see that facade and where the sign would go in this location, basically right here. And then as you drive further, this would be C. This is kind of the last glimpse you get before you go to location D, which is kind of covered with foliage and trees, even at this time of the year. And then finally, as you pass the trees, you get kind of a glimpse at it as you're driving forward. Now, all these signs basically do show the Mr. B's monument sign in clear visibility. And if you assume somebody's traveling at the speed limit posted out there, you're talking about 2.5 seconds of visibility to 3 seconds of visibility for that sign. So you know, we did want to respect the opinion of the board in terms of this evidence, so we did do this analysis. We don't feel that an additional wall sign in this location does substantially help any westbound traffic in terms of the visibility for the Mr. B's restaurant. The other issue that was brought up was this issue of commonality or similarity between master sign plans, and I think first of all that's, you know, it was tried to be related to the Board of Appeals members that it's not the intent of a master sign plan that all are treated similarly. If we wanted to treat all signs similarly, we wouldn't allow them at all. We would just rely on our code. The master sign plan, which I quoted in the report, basically allows for a coordinated and comprehensive approach to development. And since most developments are unique in their setup, you know, master sign plans are meant to be flexible to accommodate those needs. So we don't feel that all sign plans need to be equitable, and it would be even difficult to determine what equity you would look for in terms of Cafe Hollander versus Mr. B's. Cafe Hollander is a standalone restaurant with multiple facades facing Cedarburg Road. Mr. B's is a tenant in a multi-tenant building. So if you look at in terms of number of signs permitted, Mr. B's is already were granted 2 signs on the wall, which is twice what the code allows under a multi-tenant building. Cafe Hollander, since they have 3 facades that face the street, they're allowed 3 signs, and they have basically 3 signs and a logo, so a total of 4 along the public view. So they're 25% more signage than what's allowed under the code. And in terms of square footage, if you try to look at it from that aspect, Mr. B's actually is allowed a 60 square foot sign on the tower, which is twice what the code allows, where Hollander has a few exceptions in terms of size, but it's nowhere near double what the code allows for a single tenant building. So I think it'd be dangerous to kind of look at that equity argument when you're looking at master sign plans and determining, you know, whether they should be all equitable or not, because it's really difficult to determine what would be considered fair to developments that don't appear anywhere similar in nature, in design, or in layout. So I believe it was difficult for the board to kind of make a decision where they weren't kind of using some of their personal opinions about Cafe Hollander. I did put some of the quotes in the report. I'll go into them in detail if you'd like, but it seems like they were looking at some of the, I guess, distaste for the Cafe Hollander sign as a reason to kind of look at additional signs for this building, which I don't believe is appropriate for their role. And I think they kind of delved into a little bit maybe of policy issues that typically is met with the planning commission in determining what master sign plan should be and what it should look like. So based on all this, our recommendation is to deny as we did in the past. We just feel that the additional wall sign on that elevation does not fit in with the building, the architecture, and it does not provide any additional benefit to westbound traffic. So our recommendation is to deny. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Go to the applicant. I'm sure you have some comments.
Hi, my name is Joe Bartolotta. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come back and represent. I was unfortunately unable to be here the first time around. So I am thrilled and honored to be a part of the Mequon culture up here. For years, people would come into our restaurants and say, when are you going to move up north? When are you going to come to Mequon? We need your restaurant up here. For years and years and years, I heard that. And eventually, a space became available. It probably wasn't the best space, but it became available. We're on the end of a strip mall in a very dark corner. The building itself is very dark. And so we took a run at it, and I was very optimistic, and we saw some level of success. But we did hear over and over again that people had a hard time finding it and seeing it. As I know in the business, and I'm sure you do, visibility is an important part of a business success. And being part of the community and part of Mequon, I want this restaurant to succeed. As you all know, we took another bite at the apple. We weren't happy with what had happened with Joey Gerard's, and now we reconcepted it. We put another sizable investment into it, and I'm just looking for a little bit more visibility, which I think gives us a little opportunity to succeed on that second bite of the apple. I don't want anything to be vulgar. I don't want anything to be obnoxious. I want to be a part of the community and run a restaurant that everybody in Mequon can be proud of. And it's only going to happen if people know and can see where we are. And I respect whatever decision the board makes. I really, really do. I just want to be part of the community. And that's really all I have. I mean, we've got pictures. We got respectfully, I don't necessarily agree with the gentleman in that, I think westbound traffic, you really cannot see it. The monument signs are literally 16 inches tall. They're not very big. So there is a little bit of a visibility issue, and we are the master tenant in that building. We are the primary tenant in that building. We pay the most rent, and we take up the most square footage. So with that, I don't know. Do you have any other comments? Keith is my chief financial officer, and Marty is our sign builder. And again, whatever decision the board makes, I will accept it and continue to do the best I can for Mequon.
Thank you, Mr. Bartolotta. Commissioners, any comments? Alderman Worth?
I'm empathetic because that is a difficult building to see all together. And I understand the issue regarding the lack of visibility of the monument sign. In fact, I've been kind of testing it at night, during the day, whatever. I don't think it's very visible.
It's not very.
I also, even driving here tonight, though, looked at it, and it was very difficult to get a glimpse of the northbound facade of that building as I drove here. So even putting a sign there, I question whether that, in fact, I kind of wonder if you'd be more visible if you had a sign on the east facade of the building, because I think you see the east facade of that building longer than you see the north facade of that building at your space level.
I don't. Am I allowed to comment? I don't want to step.
Well, it's up to.
I don't disagree with that. We just thought an illuminated sign would definitely pop. It's because it's the dark side of the building. But if
So
we
it's
didn't-
east, though. But my concern isn't just your building. And I disagree with staff on one thing, and I think the explanation in the memo is kind of have your cake and eat it too. We want consistency, but we don't have to be consistent with master sign plans, and that's where we have our problems. I do think that they need to have some consistency, and that master sign plans are appropriate for effectively variances from the sign code for hardship and what have you, but it just shouldn't be, we're going to make it up as we go. And I think I've talked to a couple building owners, and their view is, for a long time, the sign code was maybe too rigidly adhered to, and then about 4 years ago, it kind of became, let's everybody do a master sign plan, because then sometimes we can get what we want. And now there is inequity between the two, and I think you can, just like variances in any other kind, you could set up some standards that created, here's the reason why in a master sign plan we will deviate from our sign code. But here's the problem in making this exception. In talking to building owners, I had 3 different owners tell me, great, if you do this, as soon as you do it, we're going to come and ask to have changes to our sign plan, because we'd love to have similar type of signage. One owner said, wonderful, I'll put an eastbound sign on the Panera building that can be seen across from McDonald's, because Panera's, the rule's always been you can't put signs on somebody else's building unless the space has no visibility from any road. Now, I'll put a sign heading, on the, am I right, east? Yeah, the east side, so that it can be seen in Panera, can be seen on Port Washington Road. I'm not a big fan of our sign code, but I do think some even-handedness and level playing field, whether there's a master sign plan or not, ought to be there. There ought to be some uniformity in how we apply it. And I think as soon as every time you make an exception, you also then have 5 other people who want the same exception and may not have as good of an argument. I think we ought to look at the sign code and as a policy matter. This body does less policy viewing and more, one-off decision-making, and determine how do we, both maintain a reasonable sign code and also assist businesses in town. I think that building is horrendously hard to see, and the signage is incredibly hard to see. But I also, and the reason why I voted against this application last time, and will do so this time, because I'm concerned about what the repercussions are as far as enforcement of what I think is a flawed code, but you don't want to, you need to have some sort of code. I think that there's some policy changes that ought to be made. But I don't know that you can, simply because somebody's got a good business, everybody's got a good business reason for wanting as big a signs and as many signs as possible. And Cafe Hollander bought a corner lot on a standalone building. They're then entitled to have corner lot signage on a standalone building. And that's the big difference. Now, there are some variances they got, some variances you got. I also think that generally the signage on your building is not your sign, but all the signage is not particularly attractive. And one way to get around it, if you want to have your name on that facade, the party that has the biggest interest in doing that is your landlord. There's nothing that I think that this body can say if they wanted to change the name of Riverside Commons to the, Mr. B's building. You can have that name there. Talk to your landlord, not us. By the way, I was there for I think your first night. Great restaurant.
Thank you.
Jack, do you have the photograph from the last time that showed the north wall with the Mr. B's sign on?
I did not put that in the packet because it wasn't an issue for reconsideration from the
You
Board
don't
of
have
Appeals.
it in the computer?
Yeah, just have a peek at it.
You can't put it up?
I don't think I can get
Okay.
access to the last packet.
I get more copies if you want.
Sure,
I've
let
got
'em
12
know.
copies.
Sure.
Everybody gets a copy.
considering what John says, and I agree with setting precedent, that could be a problem. Even if we wanted to allow a Mr. B sign on the north facade, when you look at the way this appears to me, and I'm not an artist, but it looks totally incompatible. You have a big white sign that says Mr. B's, and then you have script that says Riverside Commons. So to me, kind of like John says, you don't need to change the name of the building, but could you incorporate Mr. B's as part of the text of Riverside Commons? Riverside Commons featuring Mr. B's restaurant, or Mr. B's at the Riverside, or get rid of this white sign with a B and put some language in here that identifies that Mr. B's is in this building and that artistically complements what's already there. Or change
I think,
Well,
the whole thing.
I think you'd have to change the whole thing, because if, whatever the architecture is, you're allowing a tenant panel sign on that facade, which again, I know we're concerned about consistency, but we're still allowing a tenant panel on that facade of the building.
Right.
Which, I'm not aware of any other development where a tenant has a panel on the completely opposite side of the building, so we are kind of being inconsistent in our consistency here. So I could see of changing the name. If you change the name, I think you can get around that, because the master sign plan currently says that the name of the development gets to go on that facade. And this all came up again, as you may recall, that Hallman Lindsay had a sign up there they put up without approval, and we did not feel it was architecturally compatible with the building, and we had them remove it. And then we worked with the owner who wanted to put the Riverside sign there that was on the building where Joey Gerard was going, so that he had basically the sign, and we felt that was a good compromise to identify at least the shopping center. And I think, I know the issue of signage is always tough, and we always have, a lot of debate on signage, but when we do the master sign plans, we try to remain consistent with what the building is offering. We don't just allow waivers to allow waivers. We try to at least make sure that there's a specific reason on why we allow the waiver. Just like with the Mr. B's sign on the tower, we allowed it to be twice the size because it fit in with the massing and scale of that tower, so there was a rationale behind it. Cafe Hollander, the sign on the east elevation was allowed to be larger because we wanted the signs on the east and the south elevation to look the same, so we did allow it a little bit larger sign. And we've done that for other developments as well, like the Freighter Medical Facility, where we allowed a waiver to the height and size because of the scale and size of those buildings. So I know we're not being exactly equitable for each individual development, but we do try to look at each individual development, determine whether the request is a valid one with regard to the architecture, the design, and the compatibility with the development. We're never going to be at a point, unless we just don't allow master sign plans or sign waivers, and we require everybody to have the exact same size, which I don't know how that would work as well, because you have, the pavilions where you have Sendix, which takes up a large portion and has a larger front, versus one of the smaller little tenant buildings in there. You're going to require them to all have this exact same size. It's a very difficult thing, and we've been struggling with this probably ever since I've been here. I know we've had signage modifications over the years, at least 2 or 3 different times. So,
Too bad you didn't call the restaurant the Riverside.
now there's a good idea. Would you consider reworking the logo and incorporating Mr. B's into that on a much smaller scale? Is that something that's
Personally,
feasible?
I would think that would be a better solution for you. Now, I'm not going to say that I think you need a sign there, but if you think you need a sign there, I would say that if you work into the name of the building itself, like Riverside featuring Mr. B's or something like that, that would be something I would accept.
Please understand, I love the Hollander sign, and I love the addition of Hollander to the neighborhood. I think it's awesome for Mequon. So that my beef is not with the Hollander sign. My goal here is to try to create more awareness at a very busy intersection, that people are very impulsive when they drive by. You know, they see a sign and all of a sudden it plants a seed. It's impressions that people have that become customers. And so I'm just trying to create an impression. So maybe there's a way we can do that. I don't know.
Jack, is the monument sign as large as it can be for them?
Square footage, I'm not sure the height is compatible with the code, I know that. And I know that the Mr. B's tenant panel is bigger than all the other tenant panels on there.
Yeah.
So it does appear to be larger than all the other tenant panels in the center.
Isn't there like brush or something in front of it? It just seems hard to see.
Is there, I didn't hear the first part.
Isn't there like brush or
Like some shrubbery
vegetation
or
of some
brush?
sort?
I don't
What?
know. I don't.
I've got some hat.
I'll get out there with a saw right away, I guess. No, I have
You
to
know,
probably
from the
ask approval
picture-
for that.
Here it is.
Well, that's DOT
That's it.
right away. That's DOT right away. I mean, we tried at one point to get those signs closer to the road, but it's out of our jurisdiction, but here's kind of a blow up of it a little bit. I mean, you can see it. There is brush in this area. That does kind of limit its view, but it is.
On that tree, I think, maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, you're
It
not
does
gonna,
tend to limit what you see.
It's not real.
it's a pretty small sign.
Yeah. My thought is that if you've got the ability to, within the code, to increase the size of that sign, that would probably be one of your best choices for visibility.
You mean on the monument sign you're talking?
Yeah, on the monument sign. But
Well, that again, that runs
may
into
not
an
be
issue
the
too.
case.
I mean, for the code, they're allowed the two signs, and I mean, the owner can decide how big each of the tenant panel signs are for each tenant. Now, that may run afoul with some of the other tenants in the building, but they could also increase the size of the Mr. B's panel even larger than what's out there right now. Again, I think you're going to get issues, from other tenants in the building. They are the largest tenant, but, like Impressions, they take up basically 3 tenant spaces in that building as well. So you may get a complaint or concern that they're not being adequately signaged, as well. So
How did when was the master sign plan actually approved? And I ask that because many buildings in Mequon have at least some sort of, the signs seem to go together. Here, it seems like a hodgepodge of signs on that building also.
the original one was back, I think, in 2009. It was amended 3 or 4 different times throughout the process, so they've been kind of constantly tweaking this, and they've been in front of the commission. Originally, and I don't recall, tenant panel signs, we normally don't issue permits for because we issue for the main sign, so I'm not sure why that one's different color than the rest.
I'm talking on the building.
Yeah, the building one, at one point, I thought all the signs had to be the same black background and with the white letters, so I'm not sure what happened with this particular
It just seems
application.
like when you look at the Mequon Town Center building, just generally, the signage on that building and the types of sign in that building stand out better than the types of signs, including the existing Mr. B sign in this building.
Yeah, I think the MTC one definitely does a better job, because most of those are channel lettered signs, which these are not, and I think the channel letter definitely gives you a lot more exposure and visibility at nighttime especially, where these are all, whether it's this one or Impressions or Home and Lizzie, those are typically just non-illuminated panels up there, and they are difficult to see.
Your existing sign just looks like a white block, unless you're looking to see what it is one of the issues I guess I'd have as far as visibility, even the signs that you do have.
Well, it functions both ways. At night it turns black, and during the day it's white.
Right.
So at night, it's completely black, and you just see the red Mr. B's. Is that correct? That's how it's set up? So you're looking at the sign as it would be from the day view?
Yeah.
But at night, it becomes black, and you only see the red letters.
But that seems dark on that dark building.
Well, but it's red with a white outline.
It doesn't show up real well.
I think the former Joy Gerard sign on the tower was a lot more visible than the Mr. B sign that's out there now.
I guess my point would be if they could come back with a sign that fit better on that side, I'd be supportive of allowing that. I don't know what the other commissioners feel on that.
My inclination was, well, I agree with Alderman Worth. The fact is Pandora's box has been opened, and we do make exceptions all the time. And I try and sit back and think of what is the negative impact of a sign on that side of the building. And clearly there's no residential right there. You're in a very busy intersection. You've got Joey Gerard's with a lot of signs. So my inclination, frankly, prior to seeing this, was that I thought they should be allowed to have a sign. Then I looked at the sign, and the white, I feel, sticks out quite a bit on that side of the building. I love the mayor's concept of tying that into the whole, the riverside. If you could tie that in, I would very much be in support of that. Obviously, you're going to need to work through that with your landlord. But,
Sure.
And I understand the night, it doesn't jump out as much at night, but during the day it does. So I'm kind of being a little bit hypocritical with myself here, because even the white, I don't think it's offensive, and I don't think it's going to offend anyone. And yes, we have to have some standards in Mequon, but I don't think it's a situation that we're blinding. You know, we don't have apartments right across the street and the light's annoying them. It's a busy intersection, and I agree with you. Anytime we can help someone in our community get another impression, I'm for it. So I would agree with the mayor. If we could somehow tie that into the building signage, I'd be all for it.
Yeah, I mean, somehow, instead of having two separate signs that look completely different, have one sign that includes both.
I can,
A name for the center and including your establishment.
I totally understand that.
as part
And
of that.
that actually makes sense.
But I'd also say, other than people who work for the city or on boards and commissions, no one in Mequon, I think, knows what the Riverside Commons is. Have people referred to it either as your building or the Impressions building.
Right.
And therefore.
Paint store.
What?
Or the paint store.
And therefore, yeah, but I think,
Or the old Riverside, yeah.
I think it'd be better to put your name and not the building name on it, or change the name of the building to,
Mr. B's Riverside.
yeah, something like that.
You guys can figure that out.
Work with your landlord.
Well, it's worth a conversation with the landlord.
Yeah.
No question about it.
Okay, so
I'll move the table.
move to table and let you guys see.
So
what
the
they-
process would be, would I come up with some ideas and submit them?
I guess there would be two options. One, if you're okay with going on the path of having them, if it works out with the landlord, if they decide to change the name of the shopping center to Mr. B's, whatever, at that point, I think it would comply with the master sign plan that's currently in place. And at that point, they probably would need to come back to this body. If the owner doesn't support that or agree with that and wants to say, you know, the Riverside Commons featuring Mr. B's or something like that, I think then we still have to revisit that, and we could bring that back at a later date.
Right. However they think it'll work best. We sound like we would be amenable to it.
Do we have a second to the table?
Is that a second? Okay, motion and second to table. All those in favor say aye.
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 Thank you very much for your time tonight.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to SBA Towers LLC. Applicant is seeking building and site plan amendment approval for a 120-foot monopole and 5-foot lightning rod for a cell tower for the property at 9809 North Cedarburg Road, which is Riverbond Park, which is a cell tower that we approved a few years ago and never got built.
Yes, this was approved back in July of 2015, and the commission at the time placed a condition that the park board would ultimately decide the location of the tower and the enclosure. Originally, it was proposed to the south of the parking lot near the River Barn Pavilion. The park board determined that the best location for this would be on the north end of the property. At their meeting in August of 2015, and the Common Council did approve a lease agreement with the company back in March of 2016, but since the application has lapsed, planning commission approval is required once again. It does give us an opportunity. I mean, I don't believe the commission saw the final location of the tower and the enclosure as it's shown up on the screen. That's located on the far north end of the property, right adjacent to the cemetery, basically squeezed in between the road right-of-way and the floodway district that begins pretty much in line with the back of the cemetery. The plan itself is similar to what we seen last time in terms of the enclosure. It showed with a cultured stone with arborvitae surrounding the enclosure. The only issue we have in terms of the code is that it was shown with encroachment into that 80-foot front setback off of Cedarburg Road, and since it's considered a structure, it does have to comply with setback. So we feel there's enough room to move it back a little bit to remain out of the floodway, but still be compliant with that 80-foot setback. And we also recommend that those arborvitae that are planted at a 6 feet in height instead of a 5, I believe, which what the request was. So with that, we do recommend approval according to the conditions in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Mr. James Anderson has registered to speak.
May I?
Sure.
I was here a couple of years ago. My property's on the south border. During the discussion a couple of years ago, the question was raised by somebody on the commission who I don't think is here tonight about why don't you have a tree around it? If you go online, around cell phone towers to make them less aesthetically unpleasing, if I could, there are trees around it, and I would, in the interest of minimizing the negative effects on the property values across the street and keeping consistent with that, because I remember the park code not having something in there that reduces from the tranquility at all of the park, that the company be required to put up a tower. Now, when this came, a tree or something to hide most of the tower. When this came up last time, the representative of the company said, no, that'll affect the signal. And I've checked with an expert who's worked in this field 25 years. I called, if you Google this, cell phone, tree tower, Larson Camouflage pops up first, and I talked to them, and they laughed. They said, the trees now are designed not to reduce the effectiveness of the signals. So it is possible to put it up, and I respectfully request that if this is approved, that something like that be required. And again, there's hundreds and hundreds, you go online, of different options. And I say tree because, of course, we're in the middle of a park. If it were by Mr. B's, they have clock towers and all sorts of things. So that was what I wanted to request. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Anderson.
And as a follow-up to that, I know we did kind of discuss that. When state law changed, there was a number of things that the commission could not weigh in terms of cell towers. One of them was aesthetics of the cell tower. I guess if the council would have had that, they could have made that a condition as part of their lease agreement, but I don't believe the commission can make that a requirement.
And the state doesn't allow us to
take into consideration the aesthetics of the tower.
Mandate any changes to the aesthetics.
Is there an existing lease agreement?
I did ask the administration, and they said the council did approve one on March 8th of 2016 between the common council and the carrier. So I believe there is one in place.
Because, sorry, I'm sorry. No, I'm being rude. Go ahead.
So all that's lapsed is our approval, but the lease agreement's just sitting out there. They've been paying for that space and not using it?
If I may, Alex Novak with Novation Group Consulting. I represent SBA and Verizon Wireless in leasing, zoning, and permitting matters. One of my colleagues was here before you the first go-round. I was at another zoning hearing far away. But yes, the lease is structured with an option period. So that's what we are still under right now. The reason that the lease has not commenced into full monthly rents is because the site originally got pushed back in Verizon's budget, so we're not going to go build a naked tower and have it sitting there not functioning, because that goes against the terms of the lease agreement. We can't have a carrier there, a tower that doesn't have a carrier on it. So now the site has been brought back into Verizon's budget, and of course, then they want it built yesterday. So that's why we're here in front of you right now. But yes, there is an option and lease agreement in effect right now. And to speak upon the tree idea, I do this all over the country, and I do a lot of work in the Southwest where we do a lot of trees. We do palm trees, we do pine trees, we do eucalyptus trees. You don't want a 120-foot tree. It's going to look ridiculous. We do trees more in the 70-foot range. Trust me, a 120-foot tree would look a lot worse than a 120-foot monopole.
What about a giant sequoia?
Native to Wisconsin, yes.
But what about 70, what about a couple, I mean, I know it's not part of the agreement, but as a goodwill gesture, is that part of the budget?
That wouldn't give Verizon the height that they need.
All right, two more questions, and then I'll go back. Did the neighbors, so this gentleman must have gotten a postcard, and I remember your house is the red one that's just south, the ones across the street, did they get a postcard as well?
Everybody within the quarter mile received the
Okay, so
postcard.
they're at least aware that this is back in
Sure.
the,
I've spoke with a few people on the phone over the last couple of weeks, just
Asking
asking,
questions.
confirming basically it's the same tower, not another one in addition to what was approved last time. But yes, I spoke with a couple neighbors.
so the only screening then is the 6-foot?
Well, the
really at
enclosure
the
will be
base.
screened. Yeah, we're not going to be able to screen a 120-foot
No,
tower.
no, I
Yeah.
know, I'm thinking of, yeah, I understand that, okay. Okay, thank you.
Well, I wish we didn't have a lease in place, because I think that would give us some flexibility, at least as far as, I wish it could be pushed back much further in the park to the east, as opposed to out by the road. What?
I think that's the flood.
It's a
That would be in
floodway.
that floodway.
But I also know that this body doesn't have any choice. And somebody can vote no, but we have to approve it or they win in court. Thanks to our state legislature, we can't mandate a flagpole, which might actually be more appropriate than a tree, because there are 120-foot flagpoles, but we can't mandate that. What we can do is determine whether it meets our zoning code that and even there's some limitations on what we can do under the zoning code, mostly just setbacks. So this is really kind of rubber stamping based on, and you can thank your legislature if you don't like our inability to do anything. We could have done something with respect to the lease if the lease was still before us, because a municipality doesn't have any obligation to lease a space but that was before I was elected, when they leased this space. And I don't think we have any choice but to approve this. So reluctantly, I'd move for approval based on the conditions of the staff report.
Second.
Motion and a second. And just to add that, I know at the first time we talked about this, I mean, it was understood that we could accept it in a city park, or we could deny it in a city park because it's our piece of property, in which case they'd build it across the street or build it somewhere else. And the city park is actually farther away from people's homes than other locations where they could have put it. So we're kind of trying to do people a favor with this installation, so.
And I agree, it would have been beneficial to try to move it further east, but it has to stay out of the floodway, so that's about as far back as we can push it without being into the floodway area, so.
Okay. Didn't know where the floodway was.
Motion and second to approve. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank your lobbyists. Thank your lobbyists.
Moving on. Chapter 58 of the zoning code as it relates to stormwater management.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The applicant is requesting a text amendment to change the existing stormwater management ordinance. The ordinance was adopted in 1999. It applies to sites that disturb 1 acre of land or more, or add a half acre of impervious surface. So I know that the commission are not all stormwater engineers, so I will try to keep this out of the technical realm and make this more understandable to how this applies to all of the developments within the city. So in 1999, a master stormwater plan was developed by what was then Camp Dresser and McKee. And in that stormwater management plan, there were recommendations for what the stormwater management ordinance should be. And in that recommendation was the recommendation that all new development that is subject to the stormwater management regulations, so again, the 1 acre of disturbance or a half acre of new impervious, so new hard surface, would be required to do a stormwater management plan. And that plan would have to look at 3 different scenarios. So to make it a little bit easier, we put it out as a short little example. So the three scenarios are pre-settlement conditions, existing conditions, and then what your development is. So in the pre-settlement condition, that is when there is nothing on the land. It's before the land was settled, so farm field. So if this site was developed prior to 1999 and there's now a building and a parking lot on it, there's now new impervious surface. So say someone comes along, I'm going to develop the site now, and I want to add another building, a new parking lot, reconfigure it. I would have to do my stormwater management in a way that would bring the total flow back to pre-settlement conditions. So what it was like when it was a farm field. And what the applicant is proposing is that you bring the flows back to what it is currently.
Why don't we call it a forest?
Yeah, 'cause farm field,
A farm field is a settled.
it often has drain tile, grading, it's not a farm field, is it?
That's fair. So when I think farm field, I don't think of all the infrastructure that goes with it. So I think just a dirt field. So that's fair. So pre-settlement is no improvements done to the land. So treed or a field, something of that nature. So when you have a grassed surface, the water runs slowly off of it and filters in. When you have hard surface, it runs quicker off of it and flows off to the off-site properties. So our current ordinance says that developments need to develop to this pre-settlement condition to allow for infiltration to slow that runoff. If we change the ordinance, as the applicant is requesting, they only have to make it no worse than it is today. So how it is operating today is their standard. So that's consistent with MMSD and the DNR. So they still have to do stormwater management. They just don't have to take it as far as if it were a field or a forest.
And I guess in some ways, you're asking the new developer to make up for the omission of the previous developer to do the stormwater management that would have addressed that original problem.
True. It's true.
So you want to be fair, but maybe you end up with more water than you want. But that's the water you have today.
So again, we're talking about sites that were developed prior to 1999. After the ordinance was developed in 1999, all sites, redevelopment or new development, had to bring it back to pre-settlement. So this change only applies to sites that were built prior to 1999.
Besides the burden to the developer happens to be bringing this application, which can be an incredibly expensive burden. It also has actually inhibited redevelopment of certain sites in Mequon that are almost entirely concrete, because as the building sits there today, it may be leasable and usable, but to even create a smaller building on the site, the amount of work and cost that would have to go into it to have a nicer, higher-end, better-looking building, it may make it prohibitive to ever redevelop certain sites, particularly along Port Washington and Mequon roads. So there is one good reason for doing this. My concern in doing this at all, it's not for this site, it's not for those sites, but this also applies to certain areas of town where there is a significant water problem. And if you don't address the water, this language would ensure that the water problem never is addressed in those areas. And I guess I'm wondering, is there a balance? Is there a way to zone parts of the community that say, look, you have an inherent water problem in that area, and yes, it's too bad, but that's part of the reason why you get your property cheap, is because there's water problems in that area, and sooner or later things need to be brought up to code. We do that with all other codes, by the way. We tell people, yep, signage on your building is awful. You want to reconstruct the building or modernize it, whatever, you've got to bring it up to code. What our ordinance as it exists, says you got to bring it up to code. I just think that the code may be overly burdensome in areas where it doesn't need to be. How do you balance that?
So part of where that balance comes in is that 1 acre of disturbance or a half acre of impervious surface. So in the site example you gave where it's almost entirely hard surface already, if they're not adding a half acre of new impervious surface, they don't have to meet the stormwater management
Okay.
requirements.
But what about in neighborhoods or areas that have, I think of south of on Cedarburg Road from here, if you did some work where there's already flooding, significant amounts of flooding, or behind Homestead High School, if you're redeveloping there. What?
Lumen Christie, I think, would be a good example.
Okay, and what was the end result with Lumen Christie? Also, I was.
They never developed that property to the
Well,
to the north.
I think Lumen Christie is a good example in terms of a drainage issue. I think what they agreed to do, I believe, the new area was already grass and there wasn't a lot of improvements on it, but they actually went above and beyond the code because there was a known drainage issue on that property. But if the church itself would go away and at one point something else would redevelop there, then that would trigger for a property like that, where in that case you might want to see some additional protections in place. And I know in our current code, and I don't know if it's in the proposed language, I know there's always an out in there that says unless, as determined by the city engineer or public works director, that there's an issue that she has the ability to trump what's in the code. So that could be an option to have that in there still. That if an area is developing and an area that has known drainage issues, she could still basically require that pre-settlement condition if necessary. I mean, it's not a clear policy, again, it's going to have judgment to it, but that would be an option.
I mean, with the church that was just approved up on
Christchurch.
That cost, that added a couple $100,000 to the cost to meet this standard in an area that doesn't have drainage problems. And here, at least the applicant says that it'll be, a couple times that for an area that really doesn't have drainage problems.
Well, Christchurch would have had to do it either way because that was vacant in 1999, so there was no building on there.
But, a lot of, it's not a redevelopment, but although, is it they didn't build theirs before 99. It just seems like if you don't have a problem, why don't you get credit for the improvements that are already there? And there's got to be a way to draft this or structure it, but that also protecting those parts of town where you'd want to impose a more stringent standard because there is an existing water problem.
Why does the DNR and MSD say that it's okay
So
to
they
require that higher standard?
both MMSD and the DNR say that you can't meet what it is today, or you can exceed what it is today. So you can't make any drainage problem worse than what is currently there.
And a lot of that came up in my previous position in another community, which was all pretty much built out and urban. It would have been very difficult for redevelopment of any of those sites to occur if they had to comply. So I think they were looking at redevelopment sites in a sense that give them a fair opportunity to redevelop without having to meet that higher standard.
And in this particular case, where does the water flow?
It flows back towards the wetland that's behind the property, through the box culverts under the railroad, and then through the library property under Cedarburg Road.
To the river. So it really doesn't impact any residential properties.
No, but it would, if there's additional flows, it could potentially impact the library and the civic campus.
But it's not supposed to have any additional flows even under the new standard, right?
Theoretically, yes.
Can I give a little background on this, or?
Ms. Schaefer, go right ahead.
So we submitted our stormwater management plan last November, and we were under the impression that our plan was adequate. We were using a peak flow, a volumetric method versus peak flow. My engineer from Pinnacle had worked it out with someone from city staff that's no longer here. We then came back in April and were told that it wasn't going to work. And we have been going back and forth since then on the stormwater management plan. And I have added 3 underground tanks and pervious pavers to fulfill the Mequon requirement, to the tune of several $100,000 that I'm going to have to use, that's going to have to come from something else on the site. And in reviewing all of this, the current city ordinance is 20 years old. And MMSD and the DNR, as Bridget said, will give credit for existing conditions. So we feel this is a bit of a burden, not just to our site, but this will affect the Foxtown development across the street and other developments as well.
Commissioners. Commissioner Schaefer.
It is 20 years old. Is it because, I mean, it sounds like the reason it was as robust as it is because we do have known drainage issues in Mequon, right? There's areas where we just know that there's clay soil and for whatever reason, they just are, right? It's pervasive and it comes up over and over again. So I imagine that the code for Mequon was developed in response to that, because 20 years isn't that long ago, right? It's about when my house was built. I agree with Alderman Worth. In theory, I think it's going to be really hard to put into practice sort of sometimes this applies and sometimes it doesn't, depending on if there's existing flooding, because you may get people who have, one person who has flooding in their yard and they're very upset about it, but perhaps it's not the whole area, but that person's going to be a squeaky wheel and say, but I think that's going to be tricky. Where am I going with this? Can you tell me about the underground tanks? I'm confused about that, I guess, for one.
Well, it's just that if we have to go back to pre-settlement conditions, so when there was nothing on this site, now mind you, these buildings have been there for over 50 years, so we're going way back to when the buildings weren't there, then we have to add additional storage, and we don't have the land to increase the size of our stormwater pond, so we have to add underground storage water tanks. And because of the way the site is designed, we can't just put in one large tank like we did at the town center. We have to do 3 separate tanks. And then in addition, we do the pervious pavers, which I don't know if any of you have seen those at the town center. Your shoes get stuck, there's gravel, they get clogged. I mean, it just doesn't work. But we do it because we were trying to comply with the code. And honestly, we don't want water in our buildings, or we don't want to flood our neighbors, so I don't want to propose something that isn't going to work. What we're talking about and have had a good conversation about is that this is what the current MMSD and WDNR codes are. So that's what we're asking for, and I think that we give the city enough discretion. I'm a little afraid of Bridget because she's a stormwater management plan expert, but no, she's great. She's great at explaining things. They still have the discretion to say, hey, you need to change this, but.
So what you've done thus far meets the current code?
No, it meets MMSD and
doesn't meet our city
WDNR,
code.
and that's why my engineer did it. But Mequon's code takes it to these pre-existing conditions.
So if I may speak to the code was intentionally done in 1999 to be more restrictive for that purpose, and I did include some of the information I found of the determination when that was going through the Planning Commission, Public Works, and the Common Council process back then, so that it would provide some background to where this came from and why we're again talking about it.
Didn't DNR have a different standard then, though?
It was slightly different. It was more subjective in like the types of modeling that would be done, not necessarily in the actual metrics that were used. So computer modeling in 1999 versus computer modeling in 2017 are very different. So the technical standards have been updated to go along with technology, but the actual metrics of what they require have been very similar.
But couldn't you know what I was saying, that doing districts or zones or what have you, couldn't you, from the, the city, it's old, but the stormwater management plan that exists or what have you, you look at where the water drains, and if water is draining from an area into a part of the city that has significant drainage problems, you create that as one zone. If water like this site and much of the town center area is draining into the river, that's a different zone, and apply this on a zone-by-zone basis.
We could, but by the time we worked out the zones, you'd be encompassing a lot of the city of Mequon.
Okay.
I'm struggling a little bit maybe to understand John's point. If you have a situation now where there's a water problem, is your contention that we should try to create something that corrects that problem if it gets developed?
Yeah, I think if you've got an area where there's a water problem, that over time you're going to make it better if you maintain the existing standard. Because that actually improves the water storage and water, both quantity and quality of water that runs off of a property. Where you're in an area where there isn't a water problem, I think the DNR standards work throughout most of the state. It doesn't create problems. Because if right now everything's okay and you're keeping the quantity and quality of the water that leaves the property the same as right now, you don't have a problem. In those parts of town where there is a problem, the only way to resolve that problem is through making the amount of water, both quality and quantity, that runs off of sites, you lessen the current water issues.
But if the site is inherent to a water problem, then you're saying that the burden of somebody developing that property is to make it better?
Yeah, they own the property. Their property is causing a water problem.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if it...
No, I'm not saying, I'm simply saying, but putting it to pre-development, you're not saying don't have any water coming off the property. It's just the amount of water that would come off the property if there was no development on the property. That's what the current standard is, right? In Mequon. That says, hey, look, if you hadn't built that massive building there, you wouldn't be creating a problem for your next door neighbor.
But if the problem already exists, you're asking for this person building this major building to not only not make it worse, but correct
What somebody else
what it was
did.
before.
Yeah, what
We do
somebody
that
else
with
did.
all other zoning code problems that exist when somebody wants to build something. And that's the property you chose to build on. And that is what the law is in Mequon right now.
Right.
I agree with this proposal. I'm just concerned by making it uniform throughout the city. Are we going to, in certain areas, exacerbate what we already have as a water problem? I guess we won't exacerbate it because it's not, arguably it should stay the same as we currently have, but never have an opportunity to fix a neighborhood.
Most of these are in residential areas where you have stormwater problems.
Right.
But in those areas, the acreage wouldn't apply to this rule, would it?
No,
Well,
and
Unless you did tore it down and redo
and
it.
to not be insensitive, but a lot of people choose to live in low-lying flood-prone areas. So to have somebody else come in and develop a property and not make the drainage any worse, they shouldn't have to make the drainage better for the people that have chosen to live there, to be fair. In this case, it's the city that didn't put in the stormwater management for its own property.
But what you're talking about on those most people moving into a residential neighborhood, unless they're in a floodplain or flood-prone area, I think are often very shocked when it turns out that their property has
Some water.
drainage problems, because they assumed that when they bought it, that they were buying a home in a neighborhood. So you're right, they bought into that problem, but there's no real disclosure of that problem to them when they buy the house. Unless they're in a flood, unless they're in a FEMA.
Should be on the property.
It should be. It depends what a problem, how you define a problem. We've-
Just so I understand, so we're changing the definitions for this to apply to just redevelopment, right? For redevelopment sites
Correct.
only. And you also said that the city engineer has the discretion to increase the requirements if needed, correct? So
That's a fair point, Cindy. What this would apply to is redevelopments only, so sites that were previously developed, so developed prior to 1999.
Where does it say that? Say anything about 1999 in the language, does it?
Well, after 1999, they already had to meet these conditions, so they would already
Oh, I
have
see.
stormwater management on site. So you're right, it doesn't
Okay.
expressly state that, but since the code's been enforced since then. So it applies to sites that were developed prior to 1999 that would disturb 1 acre or more of land and would increase the impervious area by a half acre or more. So once you put all of those criteria together, there are only a handful of sites in the city that this actually applies to.
I'd move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
thank you.
This will go to the Common Council.
When does this go to council?
This would go to council in December, and there would need to be a public hearing with that.
Okay.
That's a first reading in December, or is it on a first reading tomorrow?
First reading in December.
Okay.
So first reading in December and then a second, so it wouldn't really get approved till
January?
January?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Government moves slowly sometimes. And that just about does it. We have a planning commission meeting schedule that you all have, and the next meeting is Monday, December 4th, actually 1 week earlier than normal.
It looks like next year is 1 week earlier than normal in December also. How come?
Well, we always try to leave a gap before the holidays.
gonna do it
So
Santa Claus.
we've always scheduled it that, we can change it if you like.
Don't care,
We've always kept it.
I think it always should be a week before council, not.
We've been talking about
We could-
doing that.
Yeah, we've been talking about that as well.
I mean, it gives
Again.
some time for,
That makes more sense.
to adjust to whatever decisions are made and people to know what happens at planning commission.
Right. Maybe we will do that.
Move to adjourn.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We're adjourned.
Keeps